greater emergence of use case technologies. Similarly, the IIT Madras Professor Ramamurthy also mentioned that there is a need to use the locally developed components for design in India. I think he was referring to the Shakti processor, which could be embedded into domestic narrowband IoT, as well as in the radio access network distribution units, etc., which are being developed under the 5G program. So this greater collaboration between various parts of the Indian ecosystem is being referred to by him. Then there is also need to align all private and public institutional efforts across the ecosystem, because it is felt that sometimes a lot of these institutions, R&D institutions, including within the government and outside, actually overlap and try to reinvent the wheel all by themselves. So it was felt that all of the institutions must join together in a collaborative effort where we divide the pieces of work and then collaborate for producing a whole. So this kind of an effort, I think, is required going forward. This was an excellent suggestion that was received. Then an interdisciplinary lab ecosystem and certification for validation is something which is very important for actually IP development within the country. Next, please. There was also a suggestion on the connectivity components. One of them was on designing a new OFC cable embedded with power cables, because essentially they were referring to the which has reached out to every village with power energy availability through electrical cables. So there was a feeling that this strength could be further harnessed by designing a new OFC cable which can be integrated with the power cables to reach out to every village. Similarly, collaborations with DISCOMs, which already have the right of way to all the villages, must be harnessed to reach out to every village to achieve what the Honorable Prime Minister had said in reaching out to all the 6 lakh villages soon. Integration of communication solutions for electric vehicles is also something which there was a suggestion. Strong backhaul and connectivity and broadband connectivity using the new highways which are being built is something which needs to be given attention. Then need for spectrum use for meeting the rural needs and urban needs was mentioned, specifically with reference to E-band and V-band. So Professor Abhay Karndikar mentioned that at least 5 carriers of E-band should be delicensed to enable such use cases in rural areas, and also to proliferate the broadband speeds in rural areas. There was also the suggestion that V-band has to be delicensed to enable low power use within in captive networks. There was also a few suggestions related to captive networks, that there is a need for policies for captive networks enabling Industry 4 to flower within this country. These are some of the major suggestions which have been received during this. We will be giving a more detailed note with other suggestions also which have been received. I am stopping here because of limitation of time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Rajaramam. We now go on to Dr. Shekhar Mande, Secretary, Department of Science and Scientific and Industrial Research, DG CSIR. Dr. Mande.
Thank you, Professor Vijayaraghavan. So, as was mentioned by Honorable Prime Minister in his speech today morning, he said that circular economy approach will not only reduce waste, but also enable competitive industry to grow and enhance public health. So there was a key message actually in the morning, and we were assigned on these lines 4 different themes that we discussed on. One was on e-waste, the second one was on green energy and low carbon technology, the third was on energy efficiency, and the fourth one on e-mobility and battery swapping and so on and so forth. So the discussions actually took place in this, and multiple people from both academia and industry and the government, they participated in the discussions. Next slide, please. So in the section on e-waste, essentially people highlighted what is the current status, which I have listed on the left-hand panel there. I am not going to read out all of that, but it suggests that there is a huge scope based on the existing network to further grow in this particular area. And the substantial ground has been covered already by multiple institutions such as CMET, CPET, IITs and CSIR. But the policies interventions that might be required are also actually listed on the right hand side. That is, so we need to actually some policy framework for recycling and end use within India. We need to create an ecosystem for chip manufacturing, which already government has actually started work on this. Private sector roles are to be integrated for employment generation and role of stakeholders in capacity building. And this point came again and again in all the themes that skill development actually is absolutely necessary in all of these. Actually, all the 4 areas that we are talking of, skill development, because the scale that at which we want to operate, we need many more people, and private industries can actually come and help us in that particular aspect. And then there was creating awareness for e-waste for recycling among both users and vendors. Next slide, please. The next session was on green energy and low carbon technologies. Once again, status is lifted on the left-hand side that currently we have very high dependence on the fossil-based fuels, and by 2030 our goals are actually to 500 gigawatt of power, which would not be fossil-based, and about 25% energy demands are for cooking, which is a neglected area for transitional R&D. So this is the kind of thing actually things that came up, that we should have a biofuel policy already in place. But the policy framework that would be needed would be to develop network of industrial ecological systems, which would be essentially industry academia partnerships. The bioeconomy needs a consistent policy support, where we need to actually assure via mandates and supply side security of feedstock at stable prices. And some of it also could be agri residues and so on and so forth. Renewable power is to be dispatchable and invest in energy storage at scale, which of course the government has announced number of PLI schemes on these particular areas. Then decarbonize large energy consumers such as steel, fertilizers, thermal power, and so on and so forth. And PLI at component level for renewable power infrastructure, some of it is already in place. The Honorable Prime Minister also mentioned in the morning that 14 key sectors already have been for manufacture. The PLI schemes are in place, but probably we may need a few more in circular economy. In the next slide, we talk about energy efficiency and saving measures. Now, this also was a very fascinating session, where status is that higher energy use for our aspirations actually would lead to depleted resources. But an important point that was made was, if we actually make a shift towards electricity, that actually might actually save our dependence on some of the other energy intensive resources by use of electricity. And electricity, of course, we can generate from from renewable sources as well. The policy things that would be needed, where the private sector's roles actually needs to be integrated for employment generation in this particular aspect. Some of the very important points that were made in the policy side were things like how do we integrate the informal sector with the formal sector? For example, in e-waste recycling, we know that the integration of formal sector, informal sector needs further enhancement. And one of the suggestions that came, I just put it on for consideration here, was can we actually not also have the informal sector consider on par with small farmers and all the policies for farmers and all those things which are there. The other one was the role of stakeholders in capacity building and awareness of energy needs to be enhanced. Then audits and performance contracts and all, they also need to be improved at a very large scale. And the development of common measures and verification, they need to be highlighted. The fourth session was on next generation mobility. Can you slide, please? Yeah. This was actually on mobility, e-vehicle policies, and battery swapping, etc. Here, actually, there are a number of PLI schemes already in place in this particular domain. And the status is that charging, swapping stations, and service on fleet are emerging concepts, and they need to be promoted in this particular aspect. We know that our dependence on this thing is going to be going to be increasing in the coming time, and therefore we have to be ready for both manufacture of lithium-ion batteries and the next generation batteries, which could have different chemistries, other chemistries than this. But also the infrastructure for battery swapping and all also needs to be generated at multiple places. The policy that would be needed would be to nurture Indian industries and promote the startups for indigenous manufacturing of batteries and related components for EVs through the PLI schemes, which of course is already in place now, the PLI scheme. The minimum level of battery manufacturing needs to be at least 1 gigawatt hour to meet the 55 gigawatt hour target capacity, which is aimed by the government of India today. Then we need to actually generate industry, academia, research lab consortia, and this should be encouraged on sustainable battery chemistry and form the further policies in this particular regard. And the last point was the Indian standards need to be finalized, and this actually requires a good amount of work of our standard, which are in tune with the global best practices in what actually would be policies and all in this particular matter. And the raw material supply chain has to be strengthened to so that, I mean, we are not affected eventually by disruptions in the supply chain, logistics, and so on and so forth. So to summarize, what we actually need is to establish national capacity across public and private sectors, across academia and across industry with translational research expertise, with economically viable and globally competitive technologies, which is important. And I actually mentioned the last one in the previous slide, that we have to actually tune ourselves with the globally competitive thing, because there are too many overseas players also would be jumping the gun at some point of time. So we will actually need to have our own standards which are defined according to the global standards. The timelines are quite tight, and the global players, as I said, are waiting in the wings to come in at a very short notice. So what we need to actually is a well-coordinated set of parallel efforts with clear implementation plans and effective monitoring, where accountability would be an essential ingredient. So this is essentially what we discussed in the circular economy section, but several useful suggestions, more detailed notes are available with us. So we'll be very happy to generate a more detailed note based on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now request Secretary Science and Technology, Dr. S. Chandrasekhar, present.
Honorable Ministers and dignitaries on the call today, greetings to all of you. Today, DST has coordinated two breakaway sessions. Breakaway number 3, which was on promoting the R&D human resource in emerging areas. So revitalizing the industry academia collaboration, catering to entire innovation and technology life cycle. And the second was the transforming India through geospatial knowledge and infrastructure need for a national geospatial policy. So if we look at the first session, which was attended by the panelists, leaders from pharma, automobile industry, startups, and other sectors. And we had Dr. Satish Reddy from Dr. Reddy's, Chintan Vaishnav, Mission Director, Atal Innovation, Indranil Manna, former Director of IIT and also currently President of INAE, Shankar Venugopal from Mahindra & Mahindra, Taslim Arif Saeed, and Sandeep Verma from ACRB, and Anita Gupta from DST. So the deliberations went on for 2 hours, and the major takeaway for this, while the slides are getting uploaded, actually the major takeaways from this message has been that we need to make sure that the translational research gets the top priority, as the investments into the fundamental science have gone for the last several years, and we built a nice base. And now they wanted, all the recommendations were that how we would now put our investments into translational work. Also, one major recommendation came in the industry academia collaboration, which is not on a large scale in our country currently, is the postdoctoral culture. Many of the developed nations always have postdoctoral culture, where they're the ones who do a lot of translational work, and also the designation of those postdoctoral fellows to be getting assistant professors and on a tenure basis, and also routine technical and scientific audits and continuous monitoring of all the investments made by the government into research activities. So this one strong recommendation came up. Another one was on how we could really promote the research innovation, solving societal problems. As Honorable Prime Minister today was addressing, the science is universal, but the science has to be used for technology for the local use. So science for local use is something all the panelists have taken into consideration. Also, while we are talking on the policy framework and patents, there has been a strong desire that the patent box has to be strengthened in such a way that the financial gains are shared between academia and industry. Also, the one recommendation was many academic institutes don't have a professional tech transfer departments, and it was felt that a professional tech transfer department with proper freedom to transfer the technology to industry without too much of bureaucratic hurdles was one important recommendation came in this sector. When we are talking of the new education policy, it was also felt that if you can really embrace some of the best Western universities and top universities in the world, we're partnering with our state universities so that the ecosystem could be strengthened. Also, another important recommendation came from the industry friends was like research-linked incentives. Many a times, the industry spends a lot of money on the R&D, but they have been requesting the government that whether they could get some tax incentives when they invest monies into R&D activities. Another major recommendation came was the coexistence of the academic and industrial partners into same campus, whether an academic institute could go and coexist on industrial campus or vice versa. That way, I think the collaborative programs could go much better. And one major recommendation from our Mahindra colleague was whether industry academia can sit together and make a 10-year roadmap that both partners invest with equal vigor so that the endpoint is defined on the day one when the program is taken up. Another sector which required large attention in R&D was the agricultural sector. While we are very strong globally in agriculture and we export a lot of food products, but the quality and the science behind production of urea, ammonia, and other pesticides and all that should be taken into consideration, and the drone technologies should be brought into aggressively for this activity. So these are some recommendations which came for the academia industry collaboration. And the other session which was done was basically on promoting R&D, my apologies, was on the transforming India through geospatial knowledge and infrastructure need. So in this sector, the strong recommendation which came was leveraging the human capital that the country already has to develop products and solutions using the geospatial data now made available through an outstanding policy which allows everyone to access this data. Also, the freedom of operating drones has been a boon for this, and many startups are coming aggressively in this sector. But one major challenge has been that the shortage of the human resource. So new programs or a new curriculum to be introduced at the undergraduate and postgraduate level in the geospatial data analysis and mapping is one strong recommendation which was felt by the industry friends. Also, standardization of the professional services provided by the surveyors, VSI professionals through industry-led certification is something recommended by all the groups. So overall, I think if we look at the recommendations for this sector, improvement in capital availability to startups and other businesses, and then geospatial investment fund to be created exclusively for startups, geospatial industry development strategy, then sectoral development plans, need to come up with a way forward in the new sector, such as highlighting in today's discussion like insurance sector, carbon credits, blue economy, and devices for strategies on how the government can play a very important role. So also look for market beyond India is one strong recommendation which came up, because geospatial now data is available for international collaborators also. So this geospatial policy would allow international players also to explore our data. So these are the recommendations came up. I stop here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I now request Secretary, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology for his interventions.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I am Rajendra Kumar, sir, AS in MIT. I will present the recommendations from the panel, sir. I will share my screen.
Please.
Sir, this session was technologies for sustainable development. And we had two sessions within this slot. First was on energizing startups and deep tech with data and AI. And the second was focused on making India a global hub for data centers and cloud infrastructure. We had a star-studded panel, sir, in both the sessions. In the interest of time, I will not read out the names here. In terms of the key takeaways, sir, these are listed here. The first was that in terms of the design principles for the policies and for the initiatives, they must be focused on innovation and universal inclusion in terms of ensuring that all the startups can have access to data without any difficulty. And startups, even in rural areas, they can have access to the same set of support systems and data as the startups in the cities. The second key takeaway from this panel, sir, was on investment. There was a suggestion that we could make investments of 10,000 crore, out of which half of that could be focused on AI use cases and the remaining half on the deep tech startups. So this was suggested by the panel. In terms of the need for employment generation, skilling and reskilling are the major areas which this panel recommended, and the potential to create 5 million jobs, and then for large scale skilling. That was one key takeaway from this session, sir. Then, sir, data exchange also came out as one of the key takeaways, where the focus was on ensuring that the access to data could be uniform for all the ecosystem partners in terms of ease of finding and describing data sets, in terms of security, privacy, and payments, etc., and also in terms of transferring data. So this was another key takeaway from this panel, sir. The next one was in terms of approach for adopting AI at scale. The suggestions were that problems could be identified with the government, ministry, state governments, etc. And there has to be a structured approach for problem solving using AI. So this was a key takeaway to promote startups in AI and deep tech areas. And the 4 response vectors on which we can base our initiatives were as follows: promotion of startups, then talent creation in terms of skilling and reskilling, and then preparing the country for these futuristic technologies, and opening of data sets, because they at the heart of the startups focused on deep tech and AI and other emerging technologies. So this was a key takeaway from this panel. In terms of the policy support, data governance framework was the focus of this recommendation. Also, we need to promote a data sharing culture and quality data creation. That is the data sets which are curated for ready to use by the ecosystem partners, startups, then academic institutions, and the other entities to ensure that the startups can get full support. In terms of the data exchange, API Setu is one of the key takeaways, where the focus of the panel was that we could have the data sets that are now available in the government domain, both at the central and state levels. They need to be integrated through IT bridges, through API bridges, whereby the data sharing can be uniform, seamless, and access to data can be made so much easier for the startups. So the key takeaway was that supporting startups in deep tech and AI and other areas would be critical for the achievement of the vision, the target of 5 trillion digital economy in India by 2025-26. And these were the key focus areas in the panel, sir. In the second session, sir, the focus was on making India a global hub for data centers and AI. Again, we had an outstanding panel where the discussion was very focused on the support initiatives required for making India a global hub. So in this panel, sir, the key recommendations were as follows. The first was the need for larger scale augmentation of safe, secure, and trusted data center and cloud infrastructure. At present, the capacity in India is actually not comparable to what Even some of our neighboring countries have, like Singapore and even a smaller country in Europe. So this needs to be augmented at a rapid rate to a much larger level. Then procurement of data center and cloud services by government departments, both at the central and state level, they need to be really looked into and ensure that they are supporting the growth of data centers and cloud services in India. Then lack of skilled resources was another area where the panel mentioned that this requires to be urgently enhanced, and we need to focus on skilling. Right now, there is a supply constraint in the economy in terms of quality resources for IT sector and data centers and cloud infra specifically. So skilling has to be taken up at a larger scale across the entire country, sir. Then another recommendation was with regard to edge data centers, which the panel mentioned that they may be promoted in rural areas because we have now the new technology like 5G coming up, where the focus would be on edge computing, and edge data centers is the way forward in future, and it's also now coming up in a large way across the entire world. Then another recommendation was on data sovereignty, the need to host data in India within the Indian IT and data center infrastructure. And it was mentioned that the data protection bill would be a key regard to ensure that the data center ecosystem gets a very strong support and a good boost. The next key takeaway was on the policy to promote use of indigenous equipment for data centers. This is already a part of the policy that we have proposed, MeitY has proposed, where we have proposed to give incentives for the domestic equipment, both IT, non-IT for data centers. Then CapEx support for data center growth also was mentioned as one of the key recommendations by panel, whereby we could provide support for capital expenditure for establishing data centers in India. Then resilient and redundant fiber connectivity was a key recommendation from the panel, especially rural areas